Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, whatever the case may be. Philip Hutcheson with Word with the Herd, and glad to have you here with us again this week, season one, and we're coming down to the final few coaches before we hopefully get started with a new season of Bison Athletics. This is something we started back right when COVID hit. We decided we've got to give you a fix somehow of sports during the off time, and we thought what better way to do that than to try to introduce you to some of our coaches, get to know them better, get to know our programs better. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from people who have enjoyed these podcasts, and we've got two more coaches to go. We might have an extra bonus guest or two, but today our guest is Coach Charles Morrow, coach of the Lipscomb men's soccer team. I believe this is year 15 or 16, Charles. I'm not sure which one it is.
It's a lot. It's probably more than I intended on the front end, but happy to be here.
Yeah.
And, happy to join you today.
Yeah, glad to have you. Well, a little bit of housekeeping on the front end for people who found us somehow. They don't know how they found us. They found us either on Spotify or on YouTube, the @Lipscomb Bison's channel on YouTube, or we usually link to this show through all of our social media outlets or the weekly email that we send out. And that's @Lipscomb Bisons. So if you're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, that's the way you find Lipscomb. If you want to catch up with men's soccer, it's @Lipscomb MSOC for men's soccer. And so that's how you can follow them on Twitter or Instagram. We just had a big a recruiting class. We had a bunch of news coming out on Twitter yesterday about that recruiting class. So we might talk about that a little bit here in a bit. Now, Charles, I was doing a little research here on Twitter. I think we follow one another at Charles Morrow. But do you have Instagram, Charles? I was trying to find out if you have Instagram or not.
I think I do. I think I do. I'm not particularly active on Instagram. It's more of a way to keep tabs on players and my children than it is a way for me to communicate. But I probably should start using it more.
Well, I have to say, when I was trying to find you on Instagram, one of your sons was the first one popped up. So I know at least one. I don't name names on the air. So in any event, glad to have you here. And just last reminder for people, if you want to follow everything that goes on with Lipscomb, it's at Lipscomb Sport. Lipscombsports.com. On the web. So that's the way you'd catch up with us. So Charles, as we said, you've been at Lipscomb for a long time, but you started out as a player at Lipscomb. You transferred, I think, as I remember from your bio, started out at Queens College, which is a powerhouse in its own right. What made you make the switch back in those days?
Well, I had gone to Queens. I guess the year that I started at Queens, it had been co-ed for 2 years. Prior to that, it was an all-girls school. And Queens had decided that they were going to integrate and add males, and they were going to put a lot of money into athletics. So for me, it was coming out of high school, the opportunity to, in a great city like Charlotte, to get a good education and be at a school where there were a lot of girls and good soccer. That sounded awesome. And, I think once I got there, the soccer was very good. The education portion was fine. I think just socially, I felt like I needed to be in a different place. Quite honestly, had grown up in a family that, probably many would consider sheltered, and we were at church every time the doors are open, and got to Queens, and for the first years that I was there, it was quite a little party school, and after being there probably a year and a half, it was like, this is not where I need to be, and started looking and went back to schools that had originally recruited me out of high school, and my dad kept saying, "Hey, I think Lipscomb have started a program," and on a whim came up and took a visit, and that's how I ended up here. And the soccer at that time was it was a tough era to be in for a soccer player.
Trailblazer.
That's right. But met my wife during my time here at Lipscomb, and no regrets there, and just really happy to be a part of the program still, and have firsthand knowledge of how far we've come since
Yeah, I
those early
wonder, is
days.
that a good thing or not a good thing for the players today? Because Division One, have a lot of. You've got a deal with Puma, that you're geared out of their minds in terms of
Yeah.
awesome gear and stuff like that. And yeah, you probably came from a time when probably not quite so luxurious when you started, I would imagine.
Well, I enjoy it. I enjoy the perspective, and I enjoy when I arrived at Lipscomb. I interviewed for the job when they brought it back, and to this day, every time I see Jonathan Seaman, I thank him for not hiring me when they first brought it back. I think it was good for the school and good for me that things worked out the way they did. And it's funny how God's plans are the best plans. But I sure was bummed about it at the time. But in hindsight, really, really appreciate the way things worked out. I think for me, there's such a sense of satisfaction and the really the a couple of years ago when we made such a great run, really the only time I got emotional about it was on the plane ride after the Central Florida game, really thinking about what things were like back in the early 90s. But I would imagine, to answer your question, is it good for the players? I don't know. I try not to harp back on, you guys should appreciate what you got. But I think it's good for them to hear what they're a part of. And I think there's a sense of pride in from them as well, in that they're part of this larger story. And right now they're part of a time that, we're still able to do things that we've never done before. And certainly there's a pride in building something, rather than just maintaining something.
Well, and so, as you said, you were there during the early days. I do want to get later on maybe a scouting report on Charles Morrow, the soccer player, from you, Charles Morrow. But
Okay.
you kind of hit on it for a second, so it's maybe a good time just to talk about it for a minute. But for several years there, Lipscomb men's soccer through the mid, whatever we call that, the 20 teens, kind of was knocking on the door in the semifinals, and then finally punched through and made it to the finals and made it to the tournament and played at Butler and the NCAA Cup, I guess. And then the next year came back and did it again, except this time, this is what you were referring to for people who maybe aren't quite as familiar with the program. The team got slotted to go all the way to Washington, to Seattle, which has to be the farthest any team traveled to play their first round match, I would think.
That's right.
I didn't do the research there, but so we go out there, and they were a top 25 program, like 22 or something like that, I don't recall. But we go out there, and we beat them on PKs, I believe, if I remember right. And great match, by the way. Just a lot of, well, put it this way, I don't know if you're the coach if it's a great match, but if you're a fan, there was just a lot of action, a lot of near misses. And so Lipscomb then gets rewarded for their victory over Washington. They get to travel all the way to Orlando to play Central Florida just a couple days later. I can't remember.
That's right.
It wasn't very long, but and as I recall, you couldn't even get all the team on one flight, because you kind of have to, the NCAA, the way they do it, they just kind of jam you on planes, and so teams traveling separate.
The funny
what do you remember about all that time there, just in terms of the whole experience.
Well, it's funny, you get the draw and, the guys are excited to be there again. And there's a feeling that second go around, the Butler game, Butler was a great team and have a lot of respect for them. But I think our players, making it to the tournament the first time, it was just a huge letdown because they felt like they could have done more with that opportunity and weren't satisfied with just making the tournament. And so to get the draw in the year after, it really didn't matter who we drew. I knew that we would come in with a lot more confidence, a lot more experience, and would not be intimidated by the moment. So that was exciting. And then, you get your draw and then you contact the NCAA travel company and they said, well, we know exactly who you are. We've been waiting on your phone call and there will not be any commercial flights available to Washington. So we're going to put you on a private plane and you just tell us when you want to leave. And so that was as easy as it could be.
Right.
And of course we win and, there's celebration in the locker room and, Washington, the facilities are unbelievable. And they had put us in the visiting team locker room for football underneath the stadium. And it was built for a football team. I mean, it was large. So we've done the facility tour after the game and we've seen about as much of the football stadium as we can see as coaches. And they send me in to hurry the players up. And they're in the shower playing slip and slide and still celebrating in the locker room. And so we finally get them. And, the whole time I'm thinking, we've got another game to play. We got to get going. And we go eat and we come back to the hotel. And I finally get the email from the NCAA with our flight instructions for the next day. And I stand up on the bus to talk to the team about it. And they said, Coach, don't worry about it. Just tell them the jet to be here at noon tomorrow and we'll be good. And I said, well, it's not going to work that way. We're actually, we got home at 12:30 and our flight left at 5. So it was just hours of sleep. And,
right.
I was the last person on the bus in the morning. All the guys were there on time.
All right.
Some of us went through Atlanta to get to Orlando, and some of us went through Minneapolis. And it was a crazy weekend. We had guys taking tests and in the hotel rooms, and there wasn't a lot of practicing going on. I think that we had been offered several different practice times, and we were just trying to get our legs underneath us for that UCF game, which we never really did. I mean, I think, we won the game, but we won it in overtime, and we had to tire them out first before we could really start competing. And, we learned very quickly in that UCF game that we were in trouble. We started subbing 5 minutes in. Guys were just like, Coach, I'm exhausted. I'm dead. And so to pull yourself out in a game like that, they really were spent. So just an unbelievable run there to get through that second game. UCF was so potent offensively, and Chris Zappia had the best couple weeks of his life in goal and made some huge saves, and just a fun time. The thing that just sticks out to me, there's so many, whether it's the locker room scene at Washington or the bus scene in Orlando, there's all kinds of moments like that, but it was just so fun. I mean, just a great group of guys to go through all that with.
Yeah, easy group to cheer for. And then just to kind of put a bow on that, so for people who remember it, or if in case you don't know about it, we Lipscomb went on to play Kentucky in the Sweet 16. First time a team has ever made it in any sport at Lipscomb that far. And and really had every chance to win there too. I mean, it took a pretty special goal from them fairly late. I can't remember how long. I remember, I guess we were behind our bench. It was on the far end down there, but I just remember that.
Yeah.
Had some pretty physical players on that team, and ended up winning. But it was a great season. And so, as you said, you looking back now from a time when you came in, at just kind of barely getting off the ground when you started playing there, and now a team that's actually made it all the way to the round of 16 and consistently competing for championships. So I guess I'm curious, from just kind of to go back for a second, was soccer something that you just kind of took to early? Did you play other sports, or what? How did you develop a love for the game of soccer?
I did. I played a lot of sports growing up, and probably the sport that I was best at and reached the most elite levels, even those at a younger age. I was in competitive gymnastics for a long time, and in gymnastics you compete in levels, and at the time that I quit, I was 2 levels away from being at the sort of the Olympic level. So it was a pretty high level of gymnastics, and I ended up cutting my fingers on a bicycle sprocket, and it at that time I was practicing gymnastics. It was 3 to 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, and when I cut my fingers, it sort of kick-started my delayed onset puberty. And all of a sudden I went from being sort of short and squatty to really long and lean, and trying to transition back into gymnastics was really tough after that accident. And I can do it better now, but I couldn't really close my left hand. And there were several times where
It's a problem on the high bar or the rings.
Yeah, when you're doing these giant swings around the bar, and you rip off because you can't grip.
Right.
And when you're training those early, you're attached by ropes. But at this point, I had graduated beyond that, just jumped up and started doing them, and you start ripping off and you're not attached. It's pretty scary. So sort of got out of that, but I really got into soccer in elementary school. My dad worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Park Service, so we always lived in fairly remote areas. And during probably kindergarten through 6th grade, 5th grade, we lived in a small town in Texas. The whole school system, K through 12, I was one of maybe 4 Caucasians. The rest of the school district was Hispanic. And when we went out to recess, we weren't playing football, American football.
Right.
We were playing soccer. And that was sort of my introduction to it. And then, early in high school, I had a buddy that I guess he knew that I had played soccer, and was just like, hey, this is a way to stay in shape for other sports we were playing, and why don't you come out, and did well and excelled in it. And I really thought at the time, the scouting report on me as a college soccer player was I was fast. I was really, really fast, and could run for forever.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't have the size that I have now in terms of height. I grew several inches in college. So being a receiver in college did not think it was going to be in the cards for me, and thought that soccer was something, if I really dedicated myself and had a couple coaches along the way that encouraged me to do so, would be something that I could have a future in. Did not think it was going to be in coaching, but certainly playing in college was something I wanted to do. And once I made that decision and started playing soccer year round, things progressed pretty quickly from there.
Where do you see the biggest changes in soccer from the time, just pick the time you were playing in college to today? And you could talk about changes in the college game or college experience, or you could just talk about the game in general. Just where have you seen the biggest changes from 15, 20 years ago to today?
Well, I think the players that we get now are just so much more polished. I think that their technical ability is so much more polished, and then from a tactical standpoint, their game knowledge just coming into our program without even us sort of onboarding our system with them uh, is so much higher than it was when I was playing, and so from that standpoint, the game has just grown leaps and bounds, and that starts at the youth level, and what kids are exposed to in high school and the opportunities that they have are completely different. When I was in high school, I would often travel into Atlanta. We lived in a small town, Carrollton, and at the time there wasn't a whole lot of soccer there. So I would travel 45 minutes to an hour and a half for practice and games, every time. Um, and what we're seeing now is that is more and more, that's more the norm than it is an outlier.
Mhm.
So in metropolitan areas, kids are traveling and for those opportunities, and um, so I think it's a unique situation because I would say more so than a basketball or a tennis, or the game has progressed here in America over the last 20 to 30 years so much more than in comparison to other sports. So um, the in terms of the kids that we're getting in, trying to compare them to what was back then, it's just night and day.
Yeah, yeah. How much difference has been made just through, I guess, people who aren't very familiar with soccer or other sports may assume that all of them kind of work the same in the American system. You kind of grew up playing, quote, little league, whatever that is, that kind of level. And then they think, well, you kind of advance on into junior high or middle school and then high school and college. But in soccer, perhaps more than almost any other sport, there's kind of a whole nother parallel system that's just going on
Yeah.
outside of it. And so, talk a little bit about that for fans who don't know much about the game, about how big a part of soccer the whole developmental system, and youth travel and that sort of thing is
Right.
in soccer.
So really, it was back when I played, you had the Olympic Development Program, the ODP program, and that was sort of the entryway into national teams. Um, uh, Probably I want to say about 10 years ago, U.S. Soccer got involved, which is the umbrella that our national teams fall under, and they developed a youth academy system. Um, the youth academy system, since COVID, has sort of been blown up and reimagined. It will still exist in some form, but not the way that it had been. But basically, the kids that are in that youth academy system, they do not play. They're not allowed to play high school ball, and there's some really big um, social develop moments that are missed, and because you don't get to play in front of your peers,
Mhm.
and I totally recognize that. But basically, the idea was bring the best players in the nation together on teams, and they'll get together and play showcases, and then of course the MLS all have their youth academy teams, and the idea really is you develop your own talent, so you're saving money, even though you're spending money for these programs. You're saving money, and you're not having to go out and buy players if you're developing your own homegrown projects. And for years that program sort of worked, but there was a there was a disconnect there in that, especially when you were talking with MLS academies. First and foremost, they were really about their players continuing on with their system, and college really wasn't a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the truth is that pathway only really exists for maybe the top 1%, if 1%, and as much as those MLS academies would have you think that college doesn't develop pros, the fact is that we do. Now, the top 1%, the Christian Pulisics of the world, and those type of players, going pro right away is great for them. But there's a vast number, and you see it in players even like Logan Painter, who was a part of that team a couple of years ago that did so well. But Logan came in as a freshman and really wasn't highly recruited by anybody. And by the time that he graduated, he was a player that could play for anybody, and anybody in the country would love to have him. And there's just such a huge development that can take place during those years. Some would have you think that development happens a lot earlier, but for some, especially late bloomers, there is a huge development that takes place during that late high school, college phase.
Well, let the record show for Brent McMillan, Associate AD for External Affairs, will be thrilled that you mentioned Pulisic on the podcast. His favorite player. He's as we're recording this today, he's already spoiled what I was going to watch later today by telling me the result.
Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, so he can't contain himself whenever anybody starts mentioning Pulisic. So in any event, Brett, that shout outs to you. Well, I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned COVID in passing about affecting the academy scene, but I'm really interested in how you feel like it's affected the Lipscomb team. Obviously, the story of the year, this past year for all sports to some degree. Now, granted, soccer was able to get its season in, but certainly had some effect and is still having some effect on the team, even as we speak right now. So talk a little bit about some of the bigger challenges that you have seen for the program, or I don't know, maybe there's some positives too. I have no idea really, but what's been the effects that you've seen?
Well, the tough part is, the spring is a huge time for us to develop and gel as a team, and certainly needed some of that. The truth of the matter is, because we had to break early, there were some things we had planned on working on and implementing in this that we just didn't get to, and those will have to wait. But the truth is, I really feel like in terms of developing where we were lacking in terms of goal scoring and cohesiveness in the attacking third, returning players sort of opportunities in that. But I do, we were in a mode where the fix was going to be getting our current players better, but also an influx of attacking talent. And, certainly the returning guys will have missed out on that, but we feel really good about the guys that are coming in. The positive is in talking with players, they feel different about this fall than any other fall. I mean, you're always excited to get back, but I mean, there is a hunger right now that you can feel it when you're talking with players, that they want to get back to playing. Mm-hmm. And I hope that we get there soon.
Right.
And but I do think that whenever we are able to come back and when we do start back, that there'll be an appreciation there and a sort of renewed commitment to things that wouldn't have been possible without something like this happening. And you don't appreciate what you got till it's gone. And for a lot of our players, I think this is will be a blessing in that they've been able to experience that a little bit, and then they'll have an opportunity to take advantage of that. Well,
I've said it to Coach Forehand after I talked to the baseball team that day when March 12th, when kind of everything was happening, and I told him, I said, I feel like I've just talked to 35 guys who all blew their knee out at the exact same time. It's like season ending, immediate, shocking, devastating. And if so, but I think a lot of people recognize a lot of times players who get injured come back with a renewed appreciation, hunger for the game. You certainly see that too with graduating seniors. I mean, that's something that but I think with seniors, it's not just the health part of it. I mean, they recognize like, hey man, I just miss like hanging out in the locker room and riding the bus and, just
right.
all the playing, you definitely miss the playing, but you just miss everybody being together, working towards a common goal and the camaraderie. And of course, to your point, that usually doesn't happen, or a lot of times it doesn't happen until they've graduated and it's kind of too late.
Yeah.
But this is that unique moment where they all kind of experience the ending, the suddenness, almost like the end of a career would feel. But thankfully for a lot of them, they get to come back. And so
Right.
I do think that there'll be that probably is a hidden, hidden blessing in all of this right now. So we'll see. Well, here's one thing I was curious about. I was having this conversation today with a high school athletic director, and somehow we got off to talking about because of the way the COVID situation is. They had at their school, they had some of their sports were doing individual drills in volleyball and basketball, and we were kind of talking about how beneficial or not beneficial it is to try to do a bunch of stuff individually in volleyball or basketball. I contended that probably basketball you could do a little bit more on your own, probably. But I was curious from a soccer perspective, and maybe it's different. Maybe you say, well, for youngsters there is more or less benefit, but for college players there's not a lot. I mean, can you do a lot on your own as a college soccer player to really get that much better individually beyond just kind of fitness or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, and there's things. It's funny. There are individual skills that you develop as a youth player, and you're perfecting that throughout your career. And so, just like a youth basketball player will work on free throws, and a pro player will still practice the same thing. Certainly, there's skills and that you'll in soccer that when you're by yourself or in situations like this, there's opportunities for you to train and get better. And the truth is, can you ever be too good at free throws? Well, no, it's something you're always working on, and it's the same for soccer. So, but in a team situation, as you're preparing for a season, certainly the coordination and the pathways that are developed, and certainly if you're a team that likes to control the game through possession, rather than just dominating on physical ability, that takes some time. And it's interesting. I was talking to a neighbor of mine who is a college football coach here locally, and he said, I don't know that I'm ever going to have practice this year like I'm used to having practice. I don't know that I'll have my offensive linemen practicing together the whole year, because as soon as one lineman gets it, then I've lost my entire line. So I know that, their plan is to work on pods throughout the year, in smaller groups throughout the year. And I wonder, as we come back, does it make sense for us to, it might make sense for us to have a first team practice and a second team practice, so we don't get in those situations where we've got a game scheduled and we don't have a team to play with.
Right.
So it's going to change things. And, small individual work will be big, small group work will be big. But even all that being said, I think there'll be a time period where when we all gather together is going to be limited. And
Right.
it's going to be a challenge for the coaches to make sure from a communication standpoint that everybody's on the same page. It'll be a challenge from a standpoint of developing practices and procedures that we feel are benefiting everyone, and because whether you're on the first team or the second team or on neither, ultimately we really need to be developing everybody.
Right.
And it'll be challenging for the players, it'll be challenging for the coaches, but I think the one thing that's really encouraging right now is that everybody's so anxious to get back that we'll do whatever we need to make it happen. So
Right.
we've started thinking about how we can differently, and I'm sure over the course of the next month those plans will be solidified and ready for the challenge.
Strikes me that as you're talking, I hadn't really thought of it this way, but I do remember several years ago, Brendan Rosenthal, our volleyball coach, who we had on this podcast several weeks ago now, had a season where one of his setter, I believe she got mono. I can't remember, but she was out for like 6 weeks, and we had a setter who was, I believe, a senior, if I remember all this right, and had really not ever played. I mean, she'd kind of been behind other great setters the whole way, and yet here came her chance dead middle of the conference schedule when they needed her, and they lost the first match, I believe it was to Northern Kentucky, in 5 sets, and then went on to win like 7 in a row, 6 in a row, something like that. And I remember telling the young lady afterwards, I was like, when they write the book on this season, I mean, you're going to have a chapter in it. I mean, you were the person, and this year, perhaps more than any others, I think there are going to be players like that in all of our sports who in a normal season, maybe their number never gets called or very rarely. But who knows this year, to your point, you may have a different group out on the pitch, one night as you did just a few nights ago. And so I do think kind of this idea of having to be ready when your number's called is going to be really important this
Yeah.
year.
Now more so than ever. And we there's going to be some great stories, and we don't wish for bad luck, but we hope that some of our guys are part of some of those good stories.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so a couple of just other real quick questions, I guess, about coaching. Now I want to talk a little bit about recruiting, because I think I found that every time we do one of these, who listen to this are really interested in how recruiting works in each
Okay.
sport. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But from a coaching perspective, are there any people that just in your coaching career that you have found that you have drawn on for inspiration, or philosophically you kind of lean towards the way they view the game or playing the game? I mean, are there any of those could be inside soccer, could be outside of soccer, but who's kind of, I guess, philosophically influenced you as a coach?
Well, I think I got into coaching because I started doing soccer camps during the summer, because while I was a great youth player and high school player, once I got to college and we were joined a top 20 Division II program, I quickly learned I had been a big fish in a small pond, and all of a sudden I was a minnow in a little bit bigger pond, and really, decided if this is something I want to excel at, my commitment level is going to have to be different than everyone around me. And soccer camps was a way to do that. Specifically, working with a guy named Ralph Lundy, and he was sort of the Don Meyer of youth soccer camps, camps where there were 800 to 1,000 kids, and over 100 staff members, and I was a college player. So that just meant that I got to do all the demos and I got to train all day, every day. And, Ralph has been a great friend, and he retired this past year, and after being at the College of Charleston for a long time. And, probably don't see the game the same way that he does, but his approach in terms of how he dealt with players has impacted me. And then his just being a good person and a person of integrity and doing things the right way, has lasted a long time. And his coaching tree is vast, and several, lot of well-known coaches that have had interaction with him. In terms of how I see the game, one of the things that I did get from him, and he's very different from me personality-wise. He was an ex-Marine and very structured and regimented, and very much a disciplinarian. But one thing that I did take from him was to be your own person and be your authentic self, and coach from that rather than trying to be somebody that you're not. So, I'm a very collaborative person, and try not to have a lot of ego. So I really try to create an environment where assistant coaches and players both feel like they have input in what's how we're going to play. And I think in that environment, best ideas come to the top, and it creates an environment where everybody feels that they're vested in it, and they are not feel like they're fighting against something, but have input with something. So that's how I try to coach. Certainly there's times where it doesn't always work that way. But that's how we try to do things, for sure.
That's the goal anyway. So, well, okay. So I've put every coach in this spot. I've made them commissioner for a day. And I've said, okay, you're commissioner for a day. You can change anything you want about the game. You can change the rules. You can change, the seasons. You can change just anything you want to make a change for. You're commissioner for a day. What would be? Is there anything that you're like, man, if that ever happens to me, here's what I would do?
Specifically, the college game. I would like to see the season expanded, where we play just as many games in a longer period of time. One thing that has changed since I've played, I just think that the guys cover so much more ground in a game than.
How far does the average player run in a game right now?
It's position specific, but the players that run the most for us will run 6 miles a game. And it varies between jogs and sprints, and there's different systems being used, and really there's been an NCAA study commissioned on this, and having coached as long as I have, you don't really need a study to back up what you're seeing, but I can tell you the last 5 to 10 years that I've seen injuries that I've never seen before. So for a hip labrum tear for a year-old that has had no hip problems in the past, it's just overuse. And so, I'd really like to see, there are times when our sport, soccer, can be played in a tournament format like the World Cup, where you may have 2 games in a week. But to do that distantly over time, your body just wears down. So my first change would be lengthen the season.
Right.
And it gives us more time. When you're in season, it is just compete, prepare, compete, prepare, compete. And I sure would like to see some development in that competition segment as well.
Mhm.
And we do a good job. I think, given the system that we have, we've done a good job over the years of developing players and giving them game time. And wins against Kentucky and Louisville, who were both top 10 teams at the time that we played them, where we went up and the most important game was on the weekend ahead of us. Went into that game playing what would be considered reserves, a good
Right.
number of reserves to
Mhm.
give players rest, but also to give them experience. And fresh bodies and hunger go a long way, and we're able to get results doing that. So even in the current system, there's ways to develop players, but I think that spreading those games out over time gives even more opportunities for development,
Yeah.
and certainly protects bodies and long term
Yeah.
for these guys who playing professionally, make a living playing is probably not going to be in the cards for them.
Well, I know that's something we've talked about personally, and then
Yeah,
you've worked on quite a bit within the collegiate game in kind of your role as a coach and spokesperson. So let's move to recruiting for a second and talk about that. I find that people ask me a lot about recruiting in different sports, and so I've kind of,
mhm,
I guess you could kind of break it down a number of ways, but it's kind of its simplest. It's kind of uh, identifying the talent and then evaluating the talent and then recruiting or bringing the talent to you.
right.
So I'm curious from the identifying. You have a sport that's not just popular in this region or this country, but I mean the world is basically you could recruit the world if you wanted to. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, hard to do that or impossible to do that. But certainly, you look on our roster, we've had players and do have players right now from even other countries. So, how do, for the fans that aren't as familiar with soccer, I mean, how do you go about just in the identifying part of this? How do you kind of pick these needles out of the haystack?
well, it's first and foremost, we know what the highest levels look like, and that standard doesn't change. Um, and we will recruit domestically, and um, at the point that we recruit internationally, it's sort of the point of you get to the point of we know what we need, we know the level that this position needs to be at, and we have not found it domestically, so we need to expand our search.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's really hard. We get the question all the time. What does videotape help you guys? And for us, um, I can think of very few times where I've seen video and said yes, that it's going to be a yes for that guy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, More often for us, it's either a no from seeing video or that's interesting. I want to see more, and seeing more uh, would usually include seeing that person in person. Um, what video is really tough to go by because I don't know the standard that they're playing against.
Mm-hmm.
So video is helpful. We recruit out of the development academy a lot, and we're very familiar with those teams. So seeing video there was very helpful. But video of a player in playing high school in Mississippi, I can't glean a whole lot from that video. And there's been
Right.
good players out of Mississippi.
Right.
That's not a knock on Mississippi. Um, but so unification part is really important, and for us that comes through coaches getting out and seeing play individually. Also happens through identification camp, where if a player is really interested in us, we can have them on campus. Players can work those camps, and basically we can apples to apples, and really that's the easiest way. And I think we've done a really good job through the years of using those to identify players that we feel like can help out.
Mm-hmm.
There are programs that will use it solely money maker, and certainly that's part of it. But we've used it to identify and have had players come out of those camps that have ended up being on the roster and gone on and had great careers for us. Getting eyes on the player is really, really, really important. It's gotten to the point that unless someone is playing pretty consistently year round, it's going to be hard to come in and step in and fit in with the group, just because it's a high level, only in terms of technical ability, but sort of soccer IQ and understanding of the game. The last part, and while finding players that fit the level of us and the level that we compete at is really important, the last piece and the last that players have to pass is just from a character standpoint. It is really, really important. And it sounds so cliche to say it, but when you've seen it firsthand and have experienced it, our team often references the New Zealand All Blacks in a book called Legacy that was written about them. And one of their big principles is that better people make better All Blacks. And, we've seen it with us that the best teams that we've had are comprised of just really good people. And that doesn't mean that poor teams, we've had poor people, but, that correlation doesn't always work that way. But certainly the best teams that we've had, the most successful teams we've had, and ultimately the funnest experiences that we've had have really been achieved with people who were men of character and strove daily to be the best version of themselves. And that's a part of the recruiting process that's very important to us. It's not going to make a bad player a good player, but it certainly can make a good player a bad player. And that's something that we really spend a lot of time trying to get to know those guys that we bring into the program.
So it strikes me as I think about just the process again of evaluation that in most other sports, there's not a lot that you can tell or that you're really watching from just a purely competitive technical standpoint. If somebody's a pitcher, you're watching them throw the ball. Or if they're a point guard, you're watching them handle the ball or distribute or shoot or whatever. But in soccer, I mean, I don't know what percentage. I'm sure you've got some statistic, like even the player that has their foot on the ball the most amount of time on the team, what percent of the time would they actually have the ball kind of in their possession?
It's very, very small. And so I decided a long time ago that we were not going to be competitive nationally if we tried to solve problems physically as a team. We weren't going to get the top 10% of athlete in the country. So rather than try to solve problems physically, we were going to have to solve problems in different ways and through player movement and ball movement. So when we go watch play, we're looking for guys that are fast and quick and big and strong and those kind of things. But ultimately, if that's all you bring, we know that person won't fit with us.
Right.
Because if you can't solve problems any other way than just being the hammer,
right.
At some point you're going to come across a bigger hammer.
Mm-hmm.
And we're a team that are comprised of players that, while we do have hammers within the team, we're comprised of a team that understands the game at a different level than just fixing things or solving things physically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really tough position to be in because, there's an old saying that every team needs piano players and piano movers, and you better have more movers than you have players. And I've heard even coaches say you can only really have one player, the rest need to be movers. But to get a team full of guys that understand the game at a higher level, and then accept their roles, and carry them out and really chase doing that role as best they can, from a player management standpoint, sometimes can be challenging.
Yeah. Well, you see, I mean, if you just look at even the recruiting class we have right now, I mean, every one of them is coming in as all whatever. I mean, they've all excelled in where they're at. And a lot of them have been, top goal scorers, depending on the position, or, have achieved a lot of notoriety. But to your point, they come in, and a lot of times you're asking them to accept a different role than they probably ever accepted up until that point. Now, it kind of depends on the position, obviously, too, but certainly that I think that's part of I guess, the art of coaching is to try to get people who haven't probably made it there unless they, to some degree, have been kind of the piano player of sorts,
Right.
But now you've got to convince them, like, hey, to keep on succeeding, you're going to have to switch from a player to a mover at this point.
That's right.
And that's and so I do think, back to the original kind of what started this thought was, you can watch video, but unlikely that people are going to show, uh, you know, I remember watching a match. I think I even commented to you on it. It was actually one of our women's matches, but I think you and I were standing up at the grandstand, and I was telling how I think it was Christy Jones, I believe, on the women's team, had come in midway in the first period or second period. I don't remember, and she had just made run after run, really for no apparent result whatsoever. I mean, she hadn't gotten the ball. I mean, she had just, but her effort had been great, and eventually Lipscomb scored. She wasn't the one that scored, but I contended that a big reason they did score was because she had just. I said it was like a puncher just throwing body blows.
That's right.
It wasn't the KO, but it was just those runs over and over and over and over again that just eventually the defenders just got kind of tired of chasing them.
Right.
Somebody else scored. And so again, you can't really see that from a tape. Not many people are going to send you tape of 5 minutes worth of them just making runs. But sometimes that's exactly what you need, or those people that just
That's
get
right.
body blows.
And we try to do a good job. I know we encourage it, and our if a player's not on, sometimes you'll see guys on the sideline celebrating a moment like it was a goal. But we've you identify these things that over the course of a game really help and help decide who wins and loses. And in the moment, it might not seem like a big moment, but we certainly try to celebrate those as much as we can, and understand and recognize that it's just as big of a contribution as the guy that's scoring the goal.
Right.
The guy who's made a 40-yard recovery run to get back behind the ball and defend and win it back quickly. So, it's an interesting observation, and it's a game that oftentimes you have heroes and goats, but along the way, there's a million different actions and results along the way that ultimately determine the game. And
Yeah.
sort of winning the moment. If you could break it down into moments and phases of the game, winning those. If you can focus on those smaller things, ultimately the result ends up a lot of times taking care of itself. Sometimes you end up with like games like Kentucky where
Unlucky, as they say.
that's right. But ultimately, yeah. I mean, I think if our hope and is that guys feel empowered to go out and play the best they can, and regardless of the result, come out feeling good about the game plan and our approach and their performance.
Is there any team that you watch professionally, I suppose, that you would say, hey, if you wanted to get an idea of kind of how Lipscomb would like to play in a general sense? I mean, I understand we don't have, the particular pros on that team, but again, just kind of style, philosophy. Is there any team that you would say, yeah, these are teams that would be similar in that way, or is that not really a accurate way to think about it?
It's not fair because I think everybody would like to play like them, but we press really high up the field. There, a lot of times teams will play with a line of confrontation, and it's sort of until the team gets to this level, we're not going to start defending. Till the team gets to the 3-point line, or halfway between the 3-point line and the half court, we're not going to defend until they get to this line. Several years ago, we sort of did away with the line of confrontation and said, we're going to defend everywhere, and we want to hunt in packs, and we want to, as soon as we win the ball, we want to win it back as quickly as we can. And sometimes we want to bait teams into feeling like they have possession so that we can get them out of a good defensive shape and then press and win the ball there. In terms of teams that I follow, rather than follow specific teams, I like to follow coaches, and certainly like the style attacking wise, but more so defensively of what Pep Guardiola has done at Barcelona and City, and the pressing that Klopp has done. I think that those teams are teams that we emulate and try to model a game after. It doesn't always look like that, but yeah, we try.
Yeah. One more question about recruiting, then we'll kind of probably wrap it up here. But on the recruiting side, the transfer portal and transfer, I guess, just what goes on in that world in collegiate athletics. How much have you noticed that being a factor in soccer? A lot, not so much. I mean, what are your thoughts about just the whole propensity to see transfers in college sports right now?
I mean, it's tough. Sometimes you see players that transfer, and if you see a lot of them transfer, you might think, oh, there's something wrong with that program. And, sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. And, I did transfer and had very little to do with soccer. Sometimes it's just the fit. And, 18-year-olds aren't known for making the best decisions. And sometimes they make poor decisions and where to go to school. And sometimes they make poor decisions and when things get hard, just to leave and seek out a different place. We haven't had a lot of transfers since new rules have been enacted. Part of that is our culture has been so strong that I think that guys haven't wanted to leave. We've also been pretty successful during that time, so guys don't want to leave. But I do think that I like the rule in that sometimes players make mistakes and sometimes coaches make mistakes. There's been players throughout my years of coaching that we just missed on. We thought it'd be something that they never were. And, we've quite honestly, there's been players that we thought weren't going to be much that turned into fantastic players.
Right.
So coaches are part of that equation as well. And when there's a realization of this is just not a good situation, and if I want to play and I'm not going to get that opportunity here, that person should have the ability to go. I do think that the transfer rule needs some adjustment. I like to give a transfer window where during this window of time, free transfers and transfer without having to sit a year, all that's good. But right now there's nothing to stop a player who I've invested in heavily contacting me a week before preseason and saying, "Hey, coach, I've got a buddy over at so-and-so school and they need my position and they've got money for me." And whether it's legal through the NCAA to have those conversations, players are having those conversations. And I don't think that's right. And I don't think it's fair. And I don't, while I've never had to deal with that, find something that's wood to knock on. I know those situations exist, and I wonder, at times, the NCAA has swung from giving the athletes more power and more say so, and rightfully so. But I think that they need to swing back maybe a little bit to make things fair for everyone, because for a school, we haven't talked about it, but there's been several things that have taken place over the years that have gotten Lipscomb soccer from where they were in the early 1990s to where they are today. And not the least of that is the institutional support for the program. So if the institution is investing in this, there should be some way that if it's decided that person needs to leave or that person wants to leave, that there should be some recognition of that investment in that player. So it's done during a time that does not hurt the program. So I would be in favor of a transfer window under the current rules to rein things back in. But luckily, we've not had to deal with any of those issues, and we've had players that, quite honestly, could go play anywhere in the country, and luckily enough, they wanted to do it here.
Well, one of the things that I've talked with other people about in other sports is anytime a school says yes to one player, they're saying no to 4 or 5 other players. I mean, they purposely said no to other ones because they thought they were saying yes to this certain one. And so, to your point, there comes a time, the timing is sometimes such that, hey, if you had wanted to transfer, we should have had this conversation at a different time. It would have been better for the program. It would have been better for you. And it would have been better for the 4 or 5 people who wanted to be here that we said no to because we thought you were going to be here. So I think that's also a part of it. One thing that does make it, I think, interesting in soccer, I mean, some people, probably more people than not, don't realize this, but you said it to me one day. I remember specifically we were standing in the kitchen in the office, and you said it, and it never. I mean, I knew it kind of intellectually, but it just kind of clicked with me. Soccer's men's soccer is really the only team sport we have that has more starters than scholarships. So, every other sport has at least as many scholarships as they do starters, but you don't have that in men's soccer. And a lot of people don't maybe know that, different sports have different numbers of scholarships. And so that in and of itself makes it difficult because, as we said earlier, most people who come to play college were kind of the key player on their team or one of the key players, and obviously have hopes and dreams of being that in college as well. And so not only are they, maybe back to your analogy, not only are they not a piano player, they're not even a piano mover maybe for a year or two. They're not playing yet. And
Right.
that's hard for some people sometimes. So
Yeah, and
especially
you combine that with, in a lot of places, what is a toxic youth soccer culture where,
right.
if you're on a club team and you decide, well, hey, I'm paying for this and I'm not getting what I want, I'm just going to switch teams. You combine that together with low funding, comparatively speaking, across the board. It does lend itself to players who could potentially be looking to jump ship. And we're in a really good place right now and haven't experienced that, but there have been times over the time that I've been here where we've run into players that for one reason or another have decided that they want to leave, and it's never it's always a difficult situation, and timing plays a big part on that. I think the NCAA could help everyone out by identifying those appropriate moments
Yeah.
when it's good to have those conversations. I know for us, we it might sound crazy, but every year after the season, I ask Logan Painter, "Are you happy here? Or are you coming back?" And not to put thoughts in people's heads, but there's appropriate times to have conversations,
Right.
and then there's not appropriate times.
Right.
And really, the thought behind forcing those conversations and having those conversations with all players is that this is the moment.
Right.
This is the window. If we need to talk about something, let's do it now, not 3 months from now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so last question, and then we'll wrap it up. And appreciate you spending the time on this. We get a lot of people who are fans of the program who like to hear from the coach and learn a little bit more. We also get a lot of just people who like sports or who are coaches that are just kind of interested in philosophy and just different ideas and things like that. So I like to ask this question usually at some point along the way. So this will be the last one today. You've been coaching, as we said, for probably 20 years total now in your career, give or take, maybe a little bit more or less. I can't remember exactly, but certainly 15, 16 years at Lipscomb, plus some at Vandy, some at Beaumont Abbey, some at Good Pasture in high school even. So, so looking now, here you are, looking back to advising Charles of 15 or 20 years ago from a coaching perspective. Do you have any advice that if you could just be put in the magical time machine and go back and say, look, if you just think about this, or if you just do this, it'd make your coaching life easier if you just go ahead and think about this now?
I'll advise all coaches, be careful who you tie your boat to. I really appreciate your leadership and leadership of athletic directors who were patient with me in early years of coaching, because I look back and and I have regrets in terms of, I wish I would have done that differently and that differently. And sometimes it has to do with game decisions, but more often than not, how you handle a situation and deal with a player. And that's been really helpful and beneficial to me. I do think that people ask me all the time, like, man, peers that I have that have been at 4 different colleges in the time that I've been at Lipscomb, when are you looking to move on? And at what point do you look? And the thing that has been really special for me, and I didn't appreciate it when I went to school here, and I didn't appreciate it maybe when I first got here, but over the years I've appreciated it. Being at an institution that is really dedicated to growth and development. I feel like Lipscomb is a partner with me in what I'm trying to do. And, I've taught the coaches that, famous coach, won't mention names, but he was at a service academy after having a great Division III run. And being at the service academy was a really huge challenge because he taught servant leadership. And at service academies, if you're an underclassman, you are supposed to serve, you do everything for the upperclassmen. And, he eventually got it worked out and sort of changed the culture of that program. But ultimately, being at a place that shares values and shares your mission as a coach is really important. That's my in terms of coaches out there, and you don't always get to pick where you go, but the last piece is and I tell people this all the time, but it really doesn't matter whether I was coaching at Lipscomb or anywhere else. How I'm coaching, how I'm acting, how I'm interacting and treating players would be the same. I'm just lucky enough to do it at a place that has shared values. I think being yourself and trying to find institutions, organizations that share common values is really important.
Yeah. Well, Charles, thanks so much for being on today. And hopefully we've gotten people down the road on a drive or through a workout or something where they're kind of listening and or maybe they're just sitting and watching. I don't know, but appreciate you being on it. And hopefully, as you said, here in just a few weeks, we'll actually get back to the business of playing soccer and other sports again. Want to remind people, if they've been listening to us or watching us on YouTube, the best way to follow our Lipscomb soccer team, our men's soccer team, is on Twitter, on Instagram at Lipscomb MSOC, Lipscomb Men's Soccer. You can follow us that way. Obviously, if you want to follow Lipscomb, it's at Lipscomb Bisons, and that's on all of your different social media channels. If you want to find out what's going on with the team, we just had, as I said, just an article here we are recording on Tuesday the 7th. So just yesterday we had a nice article on lipscombsports.com about all of our incoming players for the men's soccer team. So you can check out those kinds of stories at lipscombsports.com as well. So Charles, we appreciate you being on here, and we'll look forward to watching the team.
Thank you.
Thank you.